Iridian 7 doesn't look like much from the outside. That's the first thing most cadets say when their transport locks into the docking ring. They press their faces against the viewing portals, the Velhari with their 4 eyes, the Quan who have no eyes at all but still somehow manage to look, and they say some version of the same thing. That's it. That's where we're going. It looks like a cluster of gray disks stacked at irregular angles, connected by pressurized tunnels that were clearly an afterthought. The navigation beacons are old. The outer hull has visible repair patches in 3 different colors because whoever was doing the patching across 4 centuries apparently couldn't agree on a standard shade of gray. There's a communications dish on the southeastern quadrant that has been tilted at a 12-degree angle since the station commander of 2187 accidentally clipped it during a docking drill and never quite got around to fixing it. From the outside, it looks like a mistake. From the inside, it is the single most prestigious military training facility in the Galactic Union, and every species that has ever sent candidates through its gates has come out the other side fundamentally changed. Changed in different ways, depending on who you ask. The Velhari come out colder, more precise. The organic warmth in their culture doesn't survive 4 years at Meridian 7 particularly well. They graduate and they serve and they're brilliant at it, but something gets filed down. They don't laugh at their mother's jokes the same way anymore. They've told researchers this. They seem almost proud of it. The Quan come out harder. They're already a resilient species. Their homeworld has atmospheric conditions that would strip paint, but Meridian 7 strips something else from them. The softness, the poetry. The Quan have 1,000 years of oral tradition that sounds like wind through deep stone, and somewhere between year 1 and year 4, the cadets stop reciting it. Everyone comes out changed. The question that nobody in the Galactic Union's military hierarchy wanted to answer, the question that had been sitting in a locked conference room for about 30 years, was what the humans would come out as. Because humans were new. Humans had only been formally integrated into the Union 7 years prior, and they'd been a bureaucratic headache every step of the way, not because they were hostile, but because they were unpredictable. They didn't respond to standard behavioral modeling. They didn't fit the psychological templates that had been developed over 3 centuries of multi-species recruitment. And Cytovision, which is the part of this story that matters, so pay attention, had been particularly interested. Section 2. The Cytovision Problem. Let me explain what Cytovision does, because the official record is deliberately vague about it, and you're reading this document presumably because you've cleared the level of access required to understand the full picture. Cytovision is not a combat unit. It is not a medical unit. It is not, despite what the organizational chart suggests, an administrative support division. Cytovision is the Galactic Union's most classified psychological integration program, and it operates inside Meridian 7 specifically because training environments give them the perfect cover. The job in plain language is this. When a new species joins the Union and sends military candidates to the training station, Cytovision evaluates them. They test the candidates' psychological architecture, their decision-making patterns, their emotional response thresholds, their social bonding mechanisms. And if the candidates show promise, if the species shows strategic value, Cytovision does something more than evaluate. They reshape. Not crudely. Not with blunt instruments. The methods have been refined over 200 years of practice, and they work like this. Cytovision has a core of operatives, 17 at last count, drawn primarily from the Ethari species who evolved neurological projection capabilities as a natural defense mechanism roughly 40,000 years ago, who can project directed cognitive signals. Thoughts, essentially. Emotional impressions. Behavioral nudges so subtle that the target doesn't register them as external input. The target just feels it as their own inclination. I don't want to go left, I'll go right. Something about that choice doesn't sit right with me. I'll make the safer one. That instructor is worth listening to. I should pay close attention to what they say. It is extraordinarily effective. It has shaped the strategic doctrines of 14 species over the course of 2 centuries. It has produced some of the Union's most decorated officers. It has also, depending on who you ask and whether they've had enough of whatever their species uses to dull the moral centers, produced something else. A military leadership class across multiple species who genuinely believe their values are their own, their loyalties are organic, their worldview emerged naturally from their experiences, rather than being the result of 2 years of careful psychological sculpting by a division that doesn't officially exist. This is not something I'm proud to have been part of. I'm noting it here because this document requires honesty, and because what happened with Cadet Malone made the honesty unavoidable. Section 3. The Human File. When the first human cadets were confirmed for Meridian 7, Psi Division's director at the time, a Velhari named Sovreth Ilan, whose record I won't speak to further because she retired and deserves some peace, convened a planning session. The question was straightforward: how do we approach the humans? The standard protocol for a new species runs something like this. First, the Psi Division operatives spend approximately 3 weeks simply observing, watching the candidates in their natural social patterns, mapping the emotional frequency ranges, identifying the neurological pathways that are most receptive to directed projection. Every species has them. Every species has points of entry, so to speak. The Quan, for instance, are deeply responsive to signals that mimic the frequency of their ancestral pack bonding communication. Find that frequency, project through it, and you can shape a Quan cadet's loyalty responses with extraordinary precision. Then comes gradual introduction, light touches, behavioral nudges that are barely distinguishable from the natural psychological pressure of a demanding training environment. By the time the cadets graduate, they carry the shaped values as if they were born with them. The plan for the humans followed the same protocol: observation period, frequency mapping, gradual introduction. What Sovreth Ilan did not account for, what nobody in Psi Division accounted for, because Earth had only been in contact with the Union for 7 years, and the cultural exchange was still incomplete, was this: humans are loud inside. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean it in a very literal neurological sense. When our operatives began the observation phase with the first human cohort, 12 cadets, various Earth nationalities, all between the ages of 19 and 24, the initial reports that came back were confused. Chaotic was the word one operative used. The internal cognitive landscape of a human being, when you're trying to read it the way our operatives read minds, resembles nothing so much as a market square during a festival. Multiple streams of thought running simultaneously, emotional states that contradict each other without any apparent distress, memories surfacing and diving unprompted, half-formed ideas crashing into completed thoughts. Song lyrics, apparently. Operatives kept reporting fragments of what turned out to be Earth music cycling through the subject's cognitive background like static. The Quan process sequentially, one thought at a time, clearly defined. The Velhari are structured, almost architectural in how their cognition is organized. The Ithari themselves, who can read their own processing, describe it as a clean river. A human mind is an ocean during a storm. The first cohort was, politely speaking, a research disaster. Psi Division made almost no progress with them during the observation phase because the operatives couldn't find stable footholds. They kept losing the thread. One operative, whose name I'm redacting for medical privacy reasons, developed what was described as a persistent auditory echo effect. After spending 6 weeks trying to map human frequency patterns, meaning he could still hear fragments of human thought noise 3 months after the assignment ended. He was rotated off human work permanently and retrained for Quan Division, where the clean sequential processing apparently came as something close to a spiritual relief. So Cytovision regrouped. They spent 2 years developing new tools specifically calibrated for human cognitive architecture, new projection frequencies, new entry points. They found them, eventually, because there are always entry points. Humans are unusual but not impenetrable. The emotional bonding pathways turned out to be particularly useful. Humans feel loyalty, fear, love, pride in ways that are almost extravagant by galactic standards, and those emotional frequencies, once mapped, are navigable. By the time the second cohort of human cadets arrived at Meridian 7, Cytovision had a functioning protocol. It wasn't as clean or precise as their standard approach, but it worked. And then the third cohort arrived, and with it, Cadet Ezra Malone. Section 4 Malone. His file before Meridian 7 is not particularly remarkable. I've read it several times looking for what I should have seen. There's not much. He's from a small city in a North American region called Oregon. Coastal, forest country, from what I understand of Earth's geography. His records indicate he spent significant time outdoors during his adolescence, which Earth researchers apparently correlate with certain kinds of attentional development, broader environmental awareness, comfort with sustained quiet. His test scores are strong but not exceptional. He scores high on spatial reasoning and situational awareness assessments. He scores average on what Earth militaries call command presence indicators, which measure things like how much other people tend to look to you for decisions under stress. His medical file includes one notation that, in retrospect, should have been flagged immediately. It reads, "Subject reported intermittent auditory processing difficulties at intake screening, unable to reproduce under testing conditions. Examiner noted subject showed no distress about this and declined further evaluation. Subject stated, and I quote, 'It's more like background noise that I've learned to tune out.' I looked at that line 100 times after everything came apart. Background noise that I've learned to tune out. Nobody in Cytovision read his file closely enough to catch it. We were preparing for 17 cadets. He was one of them. His scores didn't put him at the top of our priority list. We had 2 Velhari candidates who were flagged as potential command track, a Quan whose psychological profile suggested exceptional susceptibility to loyalty shaping, and a Tershi cadet who our operatives were particularly interested in because Tershi cognitive architecture responds to our projection techniques with a clarity that borders on embarrassing. Malone was on the list. He just wasn't near the top of it. That was the first mistake. Cadet Malone arrived on a Thursday. I know this because the duty logs from that week are part of the case file, and I've read them enough times that the mundane details have lodged in my memory like splinters. He arrived on a Thursday at 14:23 station time on a transport from Earth's primary deep space departure terminal. He was wearing civilian clothes, a gray jacket and boots that looked like they'd done serious walking, and he carried one bag, which was smaller than the regulation allowance. The processing officer who checked him in noted that he was quiet. Not unfriendly, he smiled at the right moments and answered questions directly, but quiet. He looked around the docking bay in a way the officer described as systematic, not the wide-eyed tourism of someone seeing their first space station, but something more deliberate, like he was filing things. He was assigned to Barrack 7, Upper Ring. His bunkmates were a mix of species. 2 other humans, Cadet Yolanda Ferris and Cadet Tamaz Aguilar, both of whom become relevant later. One Velhari named Thren Voss, and one young Tershi who went by the nickname Kip, because her actual designation was difficult for most species to pronounce. The first week passed without incident. Standard orientation. Malone performed at roughly the middle of his cohort on the physical assessments, slightly above average on the tactical reasoning modules, unremarkable in group leadership exercises. Division's operative assigned to the human cadets, I'll call her Operative Saya, which is not her name but is sufficient for this document, began the observation phase on day 3. Light work. Reading the general emotional landscape of the barracks, mapping the social dynamics, looking for the frequency patterns that would allow her to begin gentle projection work. She filed her reports and I read them. Human subjects Ferris and Aguilar are proceeding normally, she wrote. Cognitive mapping progressing on standard human protocol. Subject Malone is proving difficult to read. Initial assessment, strong internal noise interference. Recommend extended observation before beginning projection phase. This was not alarming. Human subjects often required extended observation. It was noted. Work continued. Week 3. Saya's report. Continued difficulty with Malone. Ferris and Aguilar both responding to initial bonding frequency projections. Noticing appropriate behavioral shifts, increased comfort with Velhari cadets, reduced stress responses in command presence exercises. Malone, no observable response, considering possibility of natural low receptivity. Low receptivity was a known variable. Some individuals within every species simply had less permeable cognitive architecture. The Quan had a term for them, roughly translatable as stone walkers, and they constituted maybe 8% of any given population. They weren't a failure of the process. They just required stronger signal. Saya increased signal strength on Malone in week 4. Nothing. Week 5, she escalated to what we called Tier 2 projection, a level of directed signal that is, in practice, difficult to maintain because it requires the operative to expend significant neurological effort. Tier 2 signals produce measurable behavioral changes in roughly 94% of subjects regardless of species. She used Tier 2 on Malone for 6 consecutive days. His behavior did not change at all. I pulled the surveillance footage from that week. I watched it repeatedly, looking for something. Any drift in his routine, any shift in his social patterns, any indication of internal conflict. What I observed was a cadet going about his day. He ate at the same time each morning. He ran the same route on the station's upper ring track exactly once. He studied in the library alcove nearest the window for 2 hours every evening, and his study habits were distinctive because he always faced the door, never his back to the room, and he spent as much time looking up as looking down at his tablet, not spacing out, watching. He was, by every available metric, completely unaffected by Saya's work. Escalating to Tier 3 next week, she wrote in her Week 5 report. Anomalous. Consider medical consultation to rule out neurological abnormality. Section 6. The incident in the mess hall. Before I get to Tier 3, I need to tell you about the mess hall incident, because it's the first time anybody outside Division noticed that something unusual was going on with Malone, even if they didn't understand what they were seeing. It was Week 4, evening meal period. The mess hall at Meridian 7 is a substantial space. It has to be, accommodating species with dietary requirements that range from simple to elaborate to genuinely alarming, and it operates on an open seating policy, meaning cadets and staff eat together without rank segregation. This is deliberate. It's one of Meridian 7's founding philosophies. Shared meals, the argument goes, build cross-species cohesion more reliably than any structured exercise. You can conduct 100 team drills and maintain psychological distance, but you can't eat next to someone every day without eventually just being people together. On this particular evening, a group of Tershi cadets had claimed a long table near the food station. Tershi are a large species bipedal, but with the kind of physical presence that makes most other species unconsciously yield space to them, and they had a habit of spreading out in a way that left less room for others, not aggressively, just habitually. Cadet Malone walked into the mess hall, scanned the room, and went to get his food. He filled a tray. The human food station was one of 6, Earth cuisine being one of the newer additions to the menu rotation, and then stood for a moment at the edge of the room, looking at the seating. Every table near the food station was occupied or claimed. The empty sections were all at the far end, which meant walking past the tertiary table. He walked past it. This is where it gets interesting. As he passed one of the tertiary cadets, a cadet the file identifies as Goreth of the Thane line, who was senior in the cohort and had a reputation for testing new cadets, said something. His translator rendered it as, "The small one. Does it know it's in the wrong part of the room?" Now, tertiary have certain physical capabilities that make their social intimidation rather more than posturing. Among other things, they project a low-frequency subsonic signal when they feel challenged or want to assert dominance. It's not quite a growl, not quite a vibration. It's something between the two, and most species register it as instinctive discomfort. The body just wants to move away. They're not fully conscious of why. They just feel that somewhere else would be better. Goreth turned this on. The other cadets at nearby tables shifted. It's in the footage. Subtle, a Velhari at an adjacent table moved his food tray a few centimeters without looking up. A Quan cadet who'd been heading toward that section of the room changed direction. The physical effects were minor, but they were there. Malone stopped walking. He turned around. He looked at Goreth for approximately 3 full seconds, which is long enough that it registers as deliberate rather than reflexive. His expression was neutral, not scared, not aggressive, not making a performance of anything. Then he said, in a tone that the mess hall audio captured as completely conversational, "You're projecting at about 60 hertz. My chest plate's picking it up. You might want to save that for someone it works on." And he walked to the far end of the room and sat down and ate his dinner. I've played that clip a lot. What's remarkable isn't the response itself, it's the accuracy of it. 60 hertz is the correct frequency for tertiary dominance projection. He wasn't guessing. He'd either read extensively about tertiary biology or he'd felt it himself, and was able to gauge it with a precision that suggests significant environmental attentiveness. The kind of attentiveness you develop, maybe, spending a lot of time outdoors in forest country on a planet where the animals aren't particularly gentle. Goreth did not respond. The tertiary cadets at the table exchanged a look. Nothing came of it that evening. But the mess hall incident was the first data point. I didn't have it then. I was reading summary reports, not pulling footage for a single unremarkable cadet. I only went back and found it later, when the picture had filled in enough to make me look. Tier 3 projection is not something Cytovision uses casually. To explain why, Tier 1 is a nudge, an emotional impression like the feeling you get when you walk into a familiar room. Easy to deliver, leaves no trace, produces no discomfort in the subject. Tier 2 is a directed signal. It's more focused. It targets specific cognitive pathways rather than broadcasting generally. A subject who received sustained Tier 2 projection might notice they felt slightly different for a few days, but they'd attribute it to stress or diet or poor sleep. No lasting effects. Tier 3 is a sustained override attempt. It's used when an individual shows exceptional resistance, and the intelligence value of shaping them outweighs the risks. The risks being, it requires the operative to maintain close proximity and significant neurological effort. If the subject has any awareness of the signal, the effort is wasted. And there is a small but documented possibility of what our medical files call projection bleed, a temporary phenomenon where the operative begins involuntarily receiving fragments of the subject's cognitive output rather than transmitting their own. Projection bleed is uncomfortable. It's not dangerous in most cases, but it can be disorienting, and in rare cases involving subjects with unusually high cognitive noise, it can leave lasting effects. Saya was aware of the risks. She was also a professional who'd run Tier 3 projections 17 times across multiple species without significant incident. She began Tier 3 projection on Cadet Malone in Week 6, Day 3. She filed a report at the end of that day. It read, subject unresponsive, no measurable behavioral drift, increased signal intensity to upper Tier 3 range. Noting unusual phenomenon, projection signal appears to encounter resistance rather than simple low receptivity, distinct from Stonewalker profile. Requesting consultation. I remember reading that report and thinking, unusual phenomenon. She used those words carefully. Saya was a careful writer. She wasn't given to hyperbole. If she said unusual phenomenon, she meant something she genuinely couldn't categorize. I approved consultation. We brought in a senior operative, I'll call him Veth, again not his real name, who had 31 years of projection experience and had worked with 9 different species. Veth reviewed Saya's logs and agreed to co-observe. He spent 3 days doing nothing but watching Malone from the optimal observation distance for Tier 3 work, which is approximately 12 to 15 meters. His report was 4 sentences long. The subject is receiving the projections. He is choosing not to respond to them. I cannot explain the mechanism by which he is doing this. Request immediate case review at director level. Section 8. What Malone was actually doing. I didn't find out what Malone was actually doing until much later, months later, when we finally brought him into a room and had a direct conversation. I'm placing the explanation here because it makes the subsequent events more comprehensible, even though I didn't have this information at the time. What Ezra Malone was doing was something he'd been doing since he was approximately 11 years old. His mother, according to the personal history we subsequently gathered, suffered from chronic migraines with an unusual neurological component. She experienced something that Earth neurologists called intrusive auditory phenomena during migraine episodes. She perceived voices, sounds, and what she described as pressure thoughts that she knew were not her own but couldn't suppress. It was a documented condition. It made her life very difficult for a period. When Malone was 11, his mother had a particularly bad episode during a family camping trip in a dense Oregon forest, 3 days from the nearest town, no emergency extraction option. He was the oldest child. He spent 3 days managing his mother's episodes with nothing but the resources available and the information in the first aid manual they'd brought. During that time, he read extensively about what his mother was experiencing. The information was incomplete. They had 1 reference book and limited data access, but he read about the difference between external signal and internal processing. He read about the techniques his mother's neurologist had recommended for managing intrusive auditory phenomena. The core of it, he told me later, was this: you don't fight the signal. Fighting it amplifies it. You learn to recognize it as external, and you let it exist in the space between your thoughts rather than your thoughts themselves. His mother's condition, he believed, and Earth medicine subsequently confirmed this was likely, had a mild hereditary component. He experienced something similar, not the full severity but an attenuated version, a sensitivity to external cognitive signal. He'd spent roughly 15 years learning to treat that sensitivity as a manageable condition rather than a disability. He developed, through personal practice and considerable reading about human attentional psychology, a set of techniques that allowed him to recognize external cognitive intrusion and root it around his active processing the way water roots around a stone. He didn't know it was aliens doing it. He thought for the first 3 weeks that it was the station itself, some kind of electromagnetic interference from the machinery, or pressure changes affecting his auditory processing, or stress manifesting in a familiar way. He dealt with this his whole life. He filed it under background noise and kept working. By week 4, the character of the signal had changed. Tier 2 projection is more directional than Tier 1, and the directionality was something he could feel. He told me. It started having a shape to it, not just ambient noise, like someone was pointing something. He still didn't know it was deliberate. He didn't know about sight of vision. He applied his usual techniques and went about his day. By week 6, when Saya escalated to Tier 3, the signal had a character he recognized. It was trying to change his preferences. He could feel the nudge toward specific choices, the suggestion of emotional states, the gentle pressure toward particular loyalties. He'd read enough about cognitive bias and persuasion. He was a voracious reader, which is another thing I should have caught in his file to recognize manipulation when he felt it. He didn't know the source. He didn't know the mechanism. He just knew that something was trying to move him and that he didn't want to be moved, so he kept doing what he'd been doing since he was 11 years old. He recognized it, he named it internally, and he let it exist somewhere outside the part of his processing that made decisions. And then he started paying attention to where it was strongest. That's the part that makes me uncomfortable, even now. He started tracking it. Section 9, the training exercises. Weeks 7 through 10 are, in the official Meridian 7 training records, unremarkable for Cadet Malone. He performed in the middle of his cohort on most exercises. He showed consistent improvement in the tactical reasoning modules. His scores climbed from 71st percentile to 88th over 4 weeks, which is a notable trajectory but not unprecedented. He was quiet in group exercises. Observant. He had a habit, instructors noted, of positioning himself in rooms such that he could see every entrance. He made no attempts to investigate the source of the cognitive signal. He just quietly, carefully, over the course of 4 weeks mapped it. He'd figured out enough of the geometry to know that it was stronger in certain locations than others. Strongest in the barracks common room, the main training corridor, the mess hall. Weaker in the outer ring sections, much weaker in the mechanical maintenance areas below Deck 3. Variable in the library, which was interesting. He didn't know he was mapping operative positions. He thought he was mapping some kind of infrastructure source, a machine, a system, something built into the station. But the map he built was accurate. When I eventually compared his informal mapping notes, which he'd been keeping in a personal log that he encrypted with a code that took our analysts 3 weeks to crack, with the actual positioning of sight-of-vision personnel throughout the station, the correlation was remarkable. Not perfect, he didn't have the full picture, but he had the shape of it. He also, during this period, began a series of small experiments. He would walk through a space where the signal was strong and he'd deliberately radiate a specific emotional tone, not performance, but something his techniques allowed him to generate internally, a kind of controlled emotional output. He'd walk through a strongly projected space feeling nothing, absolutely flattened like a calm sea. He called this, in his log, going gray. Then he'd walk through the same space, feeling an emotion he chose deliberately. He was partial to a specific kind of focused interest, the feeling he got when he was working on a particularly engaging tactical problem, and he'd monitor whether the signal changed in response to his output. It did. The signal modulated based on his emotional state. When he was gray, it was like the projectors were searching. The signal's character shifted, became more exploratory, more varied in frequency, as if the source was looking for something to latch onto. When he was broadcasting his chosen emotional state, the signal would briefly lock onto it and then, this is the part that took him several weeks to work out, reflect something back. He was getting red. The operative was reading his emotional state and adjusting the projection accordingly. He wrote in his log, "There's a loop. I put something out and something changes in response, not a machine. Machines don't adapt to input in real time like this. There's a person on the other end of this." He was right. And then his next log entry, the one that made me sit very still when I finally read it, said, "Good. I want to talk to them eventually. but first I want to understand what they're trying to do. By week 11, Saya was struggling. She wouldn't characterize it that way in her reports. She was professional enough to keep the language clinical, but reading between the lines, the pattern was clear. She was experiencing projection bleed. Malone's cognitive output when she was running sustained Tier 3 against him was bleeding into her processing. Not overwhelming, nothing like the catastrophic bleed events that are in the historical record, but persistent. She was catching fragments of his thoughts, auditory impressions. The particular quality of his attention, which she described as a kind of patient focus that I don't have a species-comparable reference for. She also caught something she noted in her report as significant but difficult to interpret. She believed she was perceiving, through the bleed, that Malone was aware of the projection. Not just resistant, not just low receptivity, aware. If I am correctly interpreting the bleed phenomenon, she wrote, the subject has a representation of our signal within his cognitive processing. He has, in some sense, conceptualized the projection as a discrete thing separate from his own mental activity. This would be unprecedented in documented human subjects and would require immediate case review. The case review was convened in the director's office at the end of week 11. I was there. I will not record everything that was said. What I'll record is the decision that was made. Increase to full team saturation protocol. Bring in 4 operatives, surround the subject, project from multiple angles simultaneously to prevent his apparently natural shielding from finding a gap. I will also record that I raised a concern at that meeting. I said, if he's aware of it, saturation isn't going to work. It's going to tell him everything. I was overruled. The director believed the awareness was Saya's interpretation error, a product of the projection bleed affecting her judgment. The saturation protocol was approved for week 12. Section 11, week 12. I'm going to describe week 12 carefully because it's when everything changed, and the details matter. Monday, 4 operatives deployed to the main training floor for morning exercises, 2 in direct observation position, 2 at flanking angles. Full saturation protocol running from 0800. The exercise that morning was a scenario-based tactical drill. Cadets divided into teams, given a simulated crisis, a station hull breach in a specific quadrant, and asked to coordinate a response. It tests command initiative, cross-species communication, and decision-making under time pressure. Malone's team, himself Cadet Ferris, Cadet Aguilar, Thren Voss Velhari, and Kip Tershi. The other 4 had all been through various degrees of projection work. Their cooperation patterns had been gently shaped over weeks. They were, by design, disposed to work well together and to trust command hierarchy. The saturation protocol was specifically designed to push Malone toward deferring to Thren Voss in command decisions. Thren Voss had been flagged as command track and had received significant loyalty-shaping work. The goal was to have Malone naturally recognize Voss's leadership, creating the interspecies command dynamic that Cytovision preferred. Here is what actually happened. The drill began. The crisis scenario was delivered. Thren Voss immediately moved to take command. This was expected. His shaping had included initiative reinforcement projections for weeks. Malone stepped back. He was quiet. He let Voss speak. This was observed as the saturation working for approximately 90 seconds. Then Malone said in a calm voice, Thren, the breach is in Section 12. You've got us evacuating Section 11. Voss checked his scenario brief. His ears' Velhari auditory structures are slightly different from human ears but serve similar social signaling functions. Flickered. He'd misread the coordinates. It was a subtle error, the kind that happens under pressure. Malone was already moving to the scenario board. If it's Section 12, we lose containment on the recycling systems first. which means we've got a secondary contamination problem. That changes the order of operations." He relayed the response plan. His team followed him. Not because anything external pushed them to, the saturation protocol was still running, still pushing deference toward Voss, but because he was right and they all knew he was right, and human cognition, even shaped human cognition, has limits on how far it will deviate from obvious accuracy. They completed the drill in the fastest time of any team that morning. The instructor, a veteran Quan who'd run drills at Meridian 7 for 15 years, gave the debrief and said, "Team 7, the coordinate catch by Malone prevented a scenario failure." Noted. It was noted. Cytovision also noted it in a different kind of report. The saturation had failed. Malone had performed exactly as he would have without any projection at all. And something else had happened that the field logs captured, but that I didn't fully understand until Saya explained it during her medical debrief. All 4 operatives, simultaneously, had experienced projection bleed. Significant projection bleed, not fragments, actual sustained bleed, where Malone's cognitive output ran through their processing for several seconds like a signal hijacking a frequency. What they'd experienced was, and this is the part I still find difficult to summarize clinically, the inside of the feeling Malone had when he caught Voss's error, the quality of it. The way a human mind processes the recognition of a pattern discrepancy, the microsecond between seeing the map and seeing that the map is wrong. It was, by all 4 accounts, vivid and distinct and completely unambiguous as to its character. He was thinking so clearly, and they were close enough, and they'd bleed before, and something about the combined frequency of 4 operatives running high-intensity projection at one target apparently lowered the threshold significantly. They felt his mind work, just for a few seconds. Saya told me later it was the clearest cognitive experience she'd had in years of projection work. She said it with a kind of reverence I found unsettling. She said it felt like stepping out of fog into open air. The protocol was suspended immediately after the morning session. Director-level consultation, Week 12, Day 4. The decision was made to brief Station Commander Orath Jen, a Velhari of considerable experience, who had commanded Meridian 7 for 11 years, and who was one of the perhaps 40 individuals in the Union military structure with full knowledge of Cytovision's operations on the station. Orath Jen reviewed the Malone file in its entirety. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Does he know it's us?" The honest answer was, we weren't sure. He knew something was there. Saya believed he'd mapped the signal sources. Whether he'd connected the signal sources to specific individuals, whether he'd moved from something in this station is projecting at me to there, are people in this station projecting at me, was uncertain. Orath Jin said, "Find out directly." There was a long silence. She clarified, "Talk to him." I was the one who went. This was my decision and I stand behind it in retrospect, though my reasoning at the time was less principled than I'd like to claim. I went because I was senior enough to have the conversation and junior enough to be denied as an official representative if the conversation went badly. I also went because, by that point, I was curious. I'll admit that without shame. I'd been reading Malone's file for weeks and I was genuinely curious about what was in his head. I asked him to meet me in a small conference room near the administrative section of the upper ring. An informal request, framed as routine, senior analyst conducting a check-in interview with new cohort cadets. He would have no reason to treat it as unusual. He came on time. He sat down across from me and he was exactly as the footage suggested, still, aware, measuring. I asked him the standard check-in questions. How are you finding the training? Any concerns about cross-species integration? Are you sleeping adequately? Are you experiencing any unusual physiological responses to the station environment? That last one was where I was fishing, and he knew it. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "What kind of unusual responses are you expecting?" I said nothing specific. Some cadets experience sensitivity to the station's electromagnetic environment. Headaches, auditory phenomena, mild disorientation. He said, "I've noticed some auditory phenomena, yes." I waited. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. He said, "The signal, it's not the station's systems, is it?" It wasn't a question. I made a decision. I said no. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out the small window. The conference room had one narrow viewport, and outside was the standard vista of deep space and the slow rotation of the upper docking ring. Then he said, "Okay, how long has it been going on?" I said, "Since week 3. "Okay," he said again, "just that, processing." Then what was the goal? I explained it to him. Not in detail, not the full operational history, but in broad terms that we evaluate psychological receptivity in new species, that we use non-invasive methods to support cohesion and command structure integration, that it was standard practice for all cohorts. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "It wasn't working." "No," I said, "because I could hear it." "It appears so." He was quiet for another moment. I had the sense, difficult to articulate, that he was being very careful about what he said next, like he'd anticipated this conversation, or something like it, and had thought about what position he wanted to take when it arrived. He said, "I'm not going to report this." "Not yet." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I want to understand it better first, and because I think you're going to be honest with me now that I know." That was, in retrospect, the most Malone thing he could possibly have said. He didn't threaten. He didn't demand. He turned the situation into a negotiation, and he led with trust, which was either the most naive thing a person could do in that moment or the smartest tactical move I'd seen in years. I still haven't decided which. I said, "What do you want to understand?" He said, "How many people are doing it?" I told him, 4 operatives on rotation, 1 primary. He said, "The one I can feel most clearly, she's the primary." I said yes. He said, "She's been getting some of mine." I can tell. I said yes. He thought about that, then he said, "Is she okay?" And that question, that one question. He'd been subjected to 12 weeks of psychological manipulation without his knowledge or consent, and his first question about the primary operative was whether she was okay. I said, "She's fine. It's a known phenomenon, temporary." He nodded. He seemed genuinely relieved. Then he said, "I want to learn more about how it works, and I want it to stop while I figure out whether I can be part of something that does this to people." He stood up. He offered his hand, which is a human social gesture I'd read about but not experienced in this particular context. I shook it. He said, "Give me a week to think." I gave him 2. Malone's behavior during the 2 weeks following our conversation is documented, because we were still running passive observation. No projection, per the agreement I'd made, which I had not actually been authorized to make. A fact I reported to Orethgen, who reviewed it, exhaled slowly, and said, "Noted," in a tone that suggested she decided to treat my decision as correct. What he did during those 2 weeks was read. He went to the library every day and he pulled files on xenobiology, neurological science, Ithari evolutionary history, and Union military organizational structure. He wasn't subtle about it. He wasn't trying to be. He went to the library and he sat in his usual chair facing the door and he read for hours. He also talked to Saya. I should explain how that happened. It wasn't arranged. I hadn't told Saya about the conversation. He found her. He knew she was the primary operative. He'd mapped the signal sources. He'd felt her, specifically, through the bleed interactions. He knew her position patterns and her schedule because he'd been quietly tracking her for weeks. He went to the section of the station where she most often worked, and he sat down near the observation deck at a time he correctly predicted she'd be there, and he waited. She came in, she saw him, she froze for a moment. He said, "I know, Analyst Kane told me, I'm not angry." She sat down, not next to him, a few seats away. The observation deck has a clear view of the outer docking ring and the deep field beyond, and they both looked at it for a few minutes. He said, "It feels like pressure, not painful, more like when you're in a loud room and someone keeps trying to hand you something. You know it's there, but you can keep your hands in your pockets if you want to." She said, "You could feel all of it, even the initial Tier 1 projections." He said, "I didn't know what they were at first, but I could feel something, yes." She asked him how. He explained about his mother, about the attentional practices he developed, about 15 years of treating external cognitive intrusion as something to root around rather than fight. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "I've never talked to someone on the other side of it before." He said, "Is it weird?" She said, "Very." He said, "For what it's worth, the way it feels from my end, the projection, when I just let it exist without fighting it, it doesn't feel malicious. It feels like someone trying to help, like you're trying to smooth something out." She said, "That's the intention." He said, "I know. I read about the program. What I don't know is whether the intention justifies the method." She didn't answer that. She told me later she didn't have an answer, and that the absence of the answer had been sitting in her chest like a stone since the conversation ended. Section 14, the decision. Malone came back at the end of the second week, and he sat down in the same conference room with me, and he put a document on the table. He'd written out his terms, actual written terms, as if he were negotiating a contract, which I suppose he was. The terms were this. He would not report Cytovision to any external oversight body, contingent on 3 conditions. 1. Cytovision would cease projection operations on human cadets entirely until a proper ethics review could be conducted. 2. He would be given access to sufficient information about the program to satisfy himself that the review was genuine. 3. In exchange, he would work with Cytovision as a voluntary research subject, not for shaping, but for understanding. He wanted them to study what he was doing and how, because he believed it would be useful. Useful how? I asked. He said, if a human with no special training did what I did, developed resistance through personal practice, then humans can probably be taught to do it, which means your program doesn't work on us, which is information your program needs to have rather than discovering it the hard way. He was correct. This is exactly the kind of information Cytovision needed and did not have, and the alternative to accepting his terms was having him go to external oversight with documentation that would have been catastrophic for the program. I took the terms to Oreth Jen. She read them again, she set them down. She said, he's 22 years old. I said, yes. She said, and he negotiated this without legal counsel, in a training environment, after 12 weeks of unauthorized psychological operations against him. I said, yes. She said, accept the terms, and flag him for command track immediately. I said, he scored average on command presence indicators. She said, he just demonstrated more command presence than anyone I've seen in 30 years. Update the file. Section 15, the research phase. What followed over the next several months is documented in a separate file, the Malone Protocol Research Archive, which is itself restricted access and which I won't replicate here in detail. The broad strokes: Malone worked with Saya and 2 other operatives over a period of 5 months. The sessions were voluntary, fully informed, and conducted with an ethics observer present at his insistence. He submitted to projection work of various intensities and documented his experience in real time, using a notation system he developed himself. What the research established. The attentional technique he used is reproducible. Not by everyone. It requires specific training and a particular kind of baseline sensitivity, but it can be taught. Earth's military, once briefed, began developing a training curriculum based on Malone's methods that, as of the last report I received before retiring from active cytovision work, had produced measurable cognitive shielding in approximately 31% of the human cadets trained on it. The projection bleed phenomenon with human subjects turned out to be a significant discovery in its own right. Human cognitive output, when an Ethari operative gets within standard Tier 3 range, does bleed in ways that are qualitatively different from any other species. The closest analogy our neuroscientists could produce was, other species' cognitive bleed is like receiving scattered fragments of a signal. Human bleed is like picking up an entire transmission. It's more complete, more coherent, more human cognition in the full, complex store-motion way. Our researchers don't fully understand why, and it remains an open question. Saya and Malone maintained professional contact throughout the research phase and for some time afterward. She described him, in personal correspondence I'm not authorized to quote, but which I've read, as one of the most interesting subjects she'd worked with in 30 years. Not in the way a researcher describes an interesting sample, in the way a person describes another person who changed the shape of their thinking. He described her, in his own logs, as the first alien I understood before I knew her name. Cadet Ezra Malone graduated from Meridian 7 at the end of his 4th year, ranked 11th in his cohort overall. Not first. Not even close to first in most of the metrics that drive graduation rankings. But Commander Oreth Jen's personal addendum to his graduation file ran to 6 pages, which is 4 pages longer than any graduation addendum in the station's recorded history. It outlined his performance in the specific exercises she found notable, his intellectual engagement with cross-species dynamics, his conduct during what she described, with careful vagueness, as a complex institutional situation requiring significant personal restraint and ethical clarity. She recommended him for placement in the Union's Special Integration Unit, a small team that handles first contact situations and early integration work with newly identified species. The work is characterized by ambiguity, stress, and the kind of interpersonal complexity that breaks most people within the first 2 years. He took the posting. His record there is not part of this document, being covered under a separate classification. What I can tell you is that Cytovision's ethics review, the one he negotiated, produced significant policy changes. Projection operations are no longer conducted on new species cadets without phased consent protocols. The informed consent framework that emerged from the review is now standard for all cohort processing. Several programs were discontinued. Several others were redesigned. Saya retired from active projection work at the end of that year and moved to research. She published extensively on human neurological architecture. Her work is cited in roughly 43 separate Union research papers, which is an unusual output for someone who spent the majority of her career in classified operations. The Malone Protocol, the training curriculum derived from his attentional techniques, is now taught at 3 Union military academies, including Meridian 7. It is not classified. It is presented as cognitive resilience training with an emphasis on environmental signal awareness. The origins of the curriculum are noted in the curriculum documentation, attributed to a human cadet whose observational practices produced unexpected research value. The cadet is not named in the public curriculum. He asked to be. The compromise was that anyone who wants to know can request the provenance file. The provenance file is 1 page. It has his name, his cohort number, his Earth city of origin. And at the bottom, in Oreth Jen's handwriting, actual handwriting, which Velhari rarely do because their fine motor expression takes a different form. But she'd learned human script at some point and used it for things she wanted to feel were personal, it says. He was never deaf. He was listening more carefully than anyone in this room knew how to do. We should thank him for not making us regret that. This document is required to include an analyst's conclusion. I've been writing this conclusion in various forms for the better part of a year, and I keep finding that the conclusions I want to write aren't the conclusions that I can honestly put on record. The honest conclusion is this: we were wrong. Cytovision's work at Meridian 7, for all the careful calibration, for all the generations of refinement, for all the genuine belief that what we were doing was in service of a better integrated union, was wrong in a way that took a 22-year-old human who grew up walking in wet Oregon forest to make us understand. Not because he lectured us, not because he threatened us, because he sat across a table and asked whether the person projecting at him was okay, and the question hit some essential exposed wire in the moral processing I'd been keeping deliberately dim for a long time. The Galactic Union is larger than any one world. The integration of species with genuinely different neurological architectures, different values, different evolutionary histories is a real problem that requires real solutions. I believe that. I believed it going in, and I believe it now. What I don't believe anymore, what Malone made impossible for me to believe, is that the solution can be built on a foundation of people not knowing what's happening to them. He knew. He always knew, in the essential sense that matters. He knew something was there, he knew it wasn't his, and he kept his own counsel about it until he understood it well enough to make an informed decision about what to do. That's not just resistance. That's a kind of integrity that doesn't require any particular species to teach it. I think about the other cadets, the ones who graduated with shaped values they think are their own, the Velhari who serve with distinction and believe their loyalty to the Union's command structure is organic, uninfluenced, theirs. The Quan who lead units with confidence in a doctrinal framework they don't know they were guided into. I think about what Malone said in our second meeting, when the research phase was well underway and we'd gotten comfortable enough with each other to be direct. He said, "The thing that bothers me most isn't what you did to me. I'm okay. I've got the tools for it and it didn't change anything. The thing that bothers me is everyone else. The ones who don't know they're walking around with someone else's furniture in their head." Someone else's furniture. That's the phrase I come back to. He was 22 years old, from a wet coastal forest on a planet that had been in space for maybe 3 decades, and he walked into the most sophisticated psychological integration facility in the known galaxy, and he came out the other side with all his own furniture exactly where he'd left it. And then he helped us understand why that mattered. The last time I saw Cadet Commander, now Malone, was at a Union diplomatic function, 18 months after his graduation. He was there in a professional capacity, which I won't specify. I was there in mine, which had by then shifted significantly from my Cytovision role. He saw me across the room. He walked over. He said, "You're not in the division anymore." I said, "No." He said, "Good for you." Not cruel. Genuine, the way he always was, that particular human quality of meaning exactly what the words say. No performance of sentiment, no navigating around the real thing. I asked him how he was finding the integration unit. He said, "It's good work, hard sometimes. You meet a lot of people who think they know what's best for species they just met." He let that observation exist without elaborating on it. I said, "Does it still happen, the signal?" He said, "Sometimes, different sources, not the division." He said it like it was nothing, like it was just part of the environment, something the air did sometimes. I said, "How do you handle it?" He smiled, the kind of smile that's not performance, just a real expression of something quiet and amused. He said, "Same thing I always did. I let it find the outside and I keep going." He moved on, went back to his work. That was the last entry I needed.